Cabooses make great centerpieces on your layout. And here's how I did a start-to-finish project of a CP rail van, coming up on JC's Riptrack. Hi there, my name is John, and welcome to JC's Riptrack. If you're looking for tips and advice on how to transform your plastic models into something that you'd see on the rails today, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon so you can be notified anytime I upload a new video. So what has your experience been on weathering a caboose? Do you treat it more like a locomotive or a piece of rolling stock? Please let me know in the comments section down below. The positive response to last week's start-to-finish project was really good. So I wanted to follow up with a model that has been teased in a number of different pictures over the past 6 months. These models have all been used to demonstrate certain techniques, but they haven't been included in a start-to-finish process, and I'm working my way through that now. Even though there are general principles in the weathering process, each car needs to be taken individually along with all the challenges that it presents. These start-to-finish projects allow me the opportunity to go into depth on one particular car. This CP Rail Caboose was a special run from Rapido Trains in Canada. It has all kinds of really special details that make it a joy to weather. The big challenge for something like this is that the prototype itself is well documented. The pre-applied graffiti is taken directly from the original, which can be found on display in Plum Coulee, a small town in southern Manitoba. It's about 100 kilometers south of Winnipeg. Since this caboose is well documented, there were several things that I did need to pay attention to. Fortunately, I didn't have to worry about the graffiti at all because the model came with the graffiti and patches already applied. However, as with most models, it comes out of the box still looking pretty pristine and shiny. So my main focus was to pay attention to all the fading and the rust detail that were present on the prototype and work out ways to apply it to match it and to be careful around the graffiti. Much of my efforts on this model were to get this right. So let's get into it. Preparing this caboose was both easier and harder than some of the others. I did not remove the trucks because of electrical contacts, but it did mean that I had to mask off the electrical contact points in the trucks themselves. Plus I had to mask off all of the windows in the caboose itself. All I used here was Tamiya masking tape. The first step was to apply an initial matte coat. I used a 3-to-1 mix of Future Floor Polish and Tamiya X21 flat base. I sprayed it evenly all over the model to give it a nice tooth to be able to handle the next step. The fading on this caboose was going to be a two-step process. One would be done by airbrush and the other would be by the dot fading technique. The first part was to get a little bit of color onto the model in a way that it would work quite well. I used a mix of white with a couple of very small bits of Tamiya Sky Gray and Buff. And then I cut it with some Tamiya Flat Clear just to give it some transparency for when I would apply it to the model. When airbrushing this mixture over the model, I wanted to keep it on the higher parts of the model itself. I would be using a little bit of the spray, concentrating primarily on the roof, turning it from the distinctive black to more of a grayish tone. I then would take the same color across the roof and then do the upper parts of the sides, trying to avoid the graffiti as much as possible, but if there was a little bit of overspray, it still would work quite well. In the previous video with the red grain car, I had mistakenly said at this step that I had applied a gloss coat. I'm going to correct the record here. What I'm using in this step with both the caboose and with the red car is a satin clear coat. I'm using a 10-to-1 mix of Future Floor Polish to 1 part Tamiya Flat Base as the mixture. This is because the next step that I'm going to be working on here, I would be applying the dot fading technique. While my camera didn't catch the entirety of the dot fading process, including on the caboose, I have a little bit more footage to show. Because I was doing a lot of models at the same time, I prepared the tray to be able to handle all 5 of the models. So I'm putting down almost every color of oil paint that I have and using a little bit of Taltine, which is a type of white spirit, and I find I quite like it. It has a fairly long drying time, which allows me to get the kind of work that I want to do. Again, the camera didn't record me applying the dots with the oil paint, but at least with this model I was able to show the more important step of the blending of the dots after they were applied. The colors that I used were titanium white, parchment, cadmium yellow, yellow ochre, light rust. Once I had completed applying all the dots, it was time to blend them. In my palette, I had 2 different wells filled with white spirit. I would wet the flat brush in one, and then I would use the other one to clean the brush. And so here I am, gently brushing downwards, starting on the roof and then working my way down the sides. And if the brush got a little bit too clean, I'd clean it off, adding a little bit more of the clear thinner to the brush, and then just gently working my way through. Again, the idea is make the dots just disappear. And this really does add a nice kind of streaky effect to the roof and the sides, and the fading on this I really was very proud of. But as you can see here, I just work my way across the model, starting with the top and moving my way down across the sides. All told, this process worked really well. It gave me the look that I wanted and enhanced the previous airbrush fading step. Once I had finished the oil work and had let it dry for 24 hours, I then came back with a clear gloss coat. I used Future to just simply coat the entire model to prepare it for the pin washes step. Now came time to apply the pin washes. This time I used a pre-mixed wash. I had some surplus MIG Productions brown wash from a long time ago. I had prepped it by putting a little bit into a well on my palette, and I was all ready to apply it. In the same way that I've applied and demonstrated pin washes before, I lightly brushed over the entire model using a bit of clear thinner just to give it some place for the wash to flow into. The one thing that I find about working with the washes is that you have to give it a really good shake. Sometimes I even had to unscrew the bottle, scrape off the bottom, and then close the bottle back up and give it a good hard shake before pouring it out into the palette. But once it was ready to go, it worked really well. And here you can see me, I'm just simply touching the details with a fine brush, and it begins to flow exactly where I needed it to go. I look for little bits of detail all across the model, look at the different panel lines, and to let it go where it needs to go. One of the things when working on something like this is that, yes, it doesn't look great when you're working on it, but this type of thing requires a paint removal step, and that is what we're going to be getting into next. Now, once I had let the wash dry for about 20 minutes, this is when I came back, and this is where the magic really happens. I came back using a dry brush and started scrubbing away on it, although almost immediately after I started applying it, I realized that I needed to do a little bit of work first, using a paper towel to take off the major portions of the wash itself. The main reason for this is that I didn't want to get too much of the wash into the brush that would go across the surface of the model. And by doing this, this gets rid of most of it. You still have to come back and massage it using the brush. Sometimes I would need to switch brushes back and forth. Sometimes I kind of switch. Depends on how much thinner was in one brush and trying to keep it as dry as possible. The main thing is to blend it, and it's more art than science, and just kind of work away from it. You want to avoid brush marks, you want to avoid tide marks. Those are the two main things that take away from the realism that this can yield. Well, I'd started on the sides. Some of the roof pieces required a little bit of attention. The original prototype is actually missing one of its chimneys. I did not have creative license to remove that from the person who commissioned me, but I still did my best, and I had to do a little bit of wash work around the top. All told, when this was done, the panel lines popped out, and this is exactly the look that I was looking for. After I had applied the wash, off camera I had applied another matte coat to seal everything in. But now it was time to work on the chipping. Unlike with some of the other models where I was using the AK Interactive's chipping color, I went straight to a rust color this time around. Colors that you see here are Mournfang Brown, Skrag Brown, and Deathclaw Brown for the different rust colors that I was working with. Primarily, I stuck with the Mournfang Brown because it gave that kind of dark rust color that I was looking for. And I would set this up and I would sponge it across the model, starting with the top. Because I had done the lighter fading on the roof, it would make the chips stand out that much more. So working with the sponge, I would put a little bit of paint into the palette. I'd tear off the sponge to create a random sort of look, and then I would gently and carefully sponge it across the model. The one thing that I wanted to make sure that I did when applying this was to go very light. So when you dip the sponge into the paint, you take most of it off. You don't want too much paint on the sponge at all. It's almost dry when you actually do the application, but it's a very, very gentle touch, and work your way across the model, but focus on the corners and places where the sponge will leave it. As a later part of this process, I would then work with a brush to enhance some very specific areas on the model itself. Some of it would be to enhance some of the rust that I had already applied. There are some spots of rust that are on the graffiti, as well as a few signature spots on the multi-mark logo itself, which really are pronounced. If I got those right, it would really make the model look like the prototype. Brushes are also very good in applying scratches. Now, they can kind of get the lines right, although sometimes you might want to come back and apply a little bit of a brush. And I had a picture of the original very close by, just off of camera in these shots, to make sure that I got it right. And I would be looking at that and making sure that I was getting these signature rust spots in place to make the model look that much more like the prototype. Because the next step was going to be applying rust streaks using oil paints, a gloss coat was necessary for this intermediate step. Now came time to apply the rust streaks. The one thing about this particular caboose is that there were some key rust streaks that we had to get right in order to make it look like the prototype. It wasn't just simply applying them anywhere, but it was specifically enhancing certain signature pieces on the model itself. I would use Abteilung 502's light rust and dark rust. The primary thing was where I had applied rust colored chips would be where I would apply the oil paints directly, just in small little dots, and then I would work my way across the model. As you can see, there's quite a few of them. I wanted to take some special care on a signature rust spot on the multi-mark on one side of the caboose. Once I was finished on one side, I then turned around and worked my way across the other side. There were also some rust streaks on the top of the model that I wanted to make sure that I also got. I just used a small brush and did dots of the rust oil paint where I needed it to go. And then came the actual streaking. The streaking was pretty easy. I just took a flat dry brush and pulled down on each of the dots. I had to use just a little bit of thinner to shape the streaks a little bit after I had drawn them down. But for the most part, this gave me the result I was looking for. And some of it comes back of just working my way through it, but all told, I was pretty happy with how the rust on this turned out. It looked pretty intense, but then going back and comparing it to the prototype pictures, I think I got it close. After finishing the rust streaks, I sealed everything in with a clear matte coat using the 3-to-1 mixture of Future Floor Polish to X21 flat base. This would protect the oil streaks and make sure that moving into the next steps that I would get everything that I needed to done. This step is the same footage that you saw in the last video, but this time the wheel sets that I'm applying are for the caboose that you see in the picture. All I did was take a bit of acrylic paint, Skrag Brown in this case, and mix it with a bit of weathering pigment, light rust from Forgeworld. I mixed the paint and the pigment together. The reason that I used the pigment was to provide texture rather than color. That's the main asset that weathering pigments provide, is that they provide a texture to it. And so with a mix of Skrag Brown and the light rust, I painted the facings of the wheels. This process didn't take too long, but it did take some effort to make sure that the base paint stuck to the facings of the wheels. One of the things that I found in applying this is that, yes, there would be a couple places where I would make a mistake and some of the paint would get to where it wasn't supposed to be. That's the next step. When painting these particular wheel sets, it was especially important for the caboose to make sure that there was no paint on the very tips of the wheel set, nor on the facing of the wheel that actually makes contact with the rail. I took a Q-tip, dipped it in isopropyl alcohol, and very carefully cleaned off the contact point of the wheels as well as the tip, just to make sure that there wasn't any paint where it wasn't supposed to be. This way, the operation of the caboose's lights would not be hindered by any sort of paint on the wheels. It was a little tedious, but ultimately this is what I needed it to do in order to make sure that the caboose was still in working order. Now was to make the model look a little bit dirty. Using a 1-to-1 mix of Tamiya Buff and Tamiya Flat Earth, I applied a coat of dust across the lower parts of the model. I had to use a hand mask in order to make sure that the electrical contacts stayed covered properly, as the masking tape on this part had fallen off. The end result brought the model together, a nice coat of dust and a nice feel of wear across the entire model. Now came time for the final reassembly. I had applied the wheels and it was all set to go. I checked to see how they looked on the bottom of the model. I was pretty happy with how this looked and the contrast that it provided, and also that the caboose itself rolled quite nicely back and forth on the desk, and it was ready to go. And here's a few pictures of the completed model up close. You can see the rust streaks as well as the different parts of the model and how it all comes together. The scratches, the little bits of rust and chipping, as well as how the fading and the dust brings it all together. Now, I was pretty happy with the end result of this caboose. Nice and worn, and it looks pretty close to the original that you will find in southern Manitoba. The main takeaway for something like this is to focus on a few signature points on the model that are present in the actual prototype. Get those right, and the rest of the model will come together quite nicely. For me, it was the rust spots in the Multimark logo that I really wanted to focus on. Focal points like this help place the model close to its real-life counterpart and enhances the sense of volume and realism. And as always, I hope you found this helpful. And if you're looking for tips and advice on how to get the most out of your painting and weathering projects, then please hit subscribe and that little bell icon and you won't miss a thing. Also, if you haven't done so already, check out some of the other videos on this channel, as well as the various links down below that cover some of the products that you see in this video, as well as links to my various social media. You can check me out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and also on my new Patreon page if you want to have a chance to participate in the creative content of upcoming videos. So thanks for watching, good luck, and may you keep on track.